Hello, everybody. Hi, welcome to the School of Music. My name is Freya Bales. I'm an Associate Professor of Music Psychology here at the University of Leeds. Welcome, huge welcome. I'm really excited about this event today. Imagining music and thinking about imagining music is something that I've been doing through my research for 25 years. I worked out this morning, which is a really long time, but I've been experiencing imagining music for a lot longer than that. Before we get started, I want to ask you a question which I normally ask my students at the start of lectures on this topic, which is hands up if anybody has any music in their head right now. Those of you who are online, you can imagine you putting your head up. I am putting my hand up because even though I'm speaking to you, I still have music in my head. So please don't be insulted. I am engaged with what I'm doing. I am engaged with talking to you, but somehow the music is still there going round and round and round. And that's what we're going to be exploring today. So a few bits of context as to why I wanted to talk about this topic today. Increasingly over the years, I get contacted by people who say, Freya, I've come across your research. Can you help me? I've got this music in my head. What can I do? More often than not, the answer is, I don't really know. And for some reason, I've been semi-satisfied with that, kind of, I don't know, I'm not going to give you the wrong advice, I'm just going to sort of ignore the problem. But for lots of people, it is a big problem. And it's a problem that I think I'm increasingly unhappy with not being able to start to address that as an issue. But at the same time, I also have research interests in music and well-being. And I'm increasingly thinking about how I can bring these two topics together as this fascination I've had with imagining music, bringing that together with the work I've been doing on music and well-being. And as part of that, I've had various research students who have been looking into how we might intentionally imagine music to improve our well-being. And that's really made me think a lot more about actually the very many different positive ways that imagining music can serve some kind of a function and be meaningful and significant in our lives. And I'd like to really today try and initiate a bit of a discussion about maybe a more nuanced picture about the various ways that we relate to imagining music. And I hope that you in the room, physical room, and everybody online, you're going to share some of your experiences, I'm hoping, in an anonymous way. But I also hope that we can make this as interactive as possible and try and think if you have any questions for our panelists, which I'm about to introduce. But before I do so, can I ask for the first slide to be shown, please? Now, hopefully that will come back up. There we go, right. Before I ask our panelists to introduce themselves, I wanted everybody online and here, if you could get your phones and use this QR code, because I'm interested in asking you to contribute some of your experiences of times when you have found imagining music to either be more like a friend or maybe a bit more like a foe. So obviously, please don't divulge information you don't want to, but this is anonymous. But at the same time, if you'd like to share an experience of a time when you can think that imagining music really was beneficial to you in some way, or the contrary, that's going to be really useful for our discussions a little bit later. So please do scan that QR code and start typing. And as you do so, I'm going to move on now. It's my huge privilege to welcome our panel today. I'm so pleased that you could join us. Thank you so much. And I'm going to ask the panelists to think about the same question as they're introducing themselves. So I'll let them do that themselves. I'd like to start with you, Andrew, if that's okay. So really my question to you is, if you could sort of say a bit about yourself, but also maybe when have you found imagining music to be a friend or maybe a foe?
Well, thank you, Freya. This is fascinating. I'm a radio presenter and producer, and have spent 30 years working in Leeds. And one of the reasons I'm here is one of those chance joys of my life, which is coming across lots of different people in lots of different contexts. And one of the things I did during COVID was produce radio services of the airwaves. I present the weekend breakfast shows on the local BBC service for this part of the country, which is a largely urban area. And I presented for years and years, but this was a new challenge to produce a radio service of the airwaves. And one of the people I worked with actually suggested my name to Freya. And one of the pieces of earworm music is the Grindthorpe Colliery Band playing Love Divine or Love's Excelling, because that was one of the pieces of music that we put into one of the radio services that I produced. And it's there. It's a friendly sound. It's a warm sound. Brass band music for me is hair on the back of the neck stuff, and it's emotional. But for me, that will forever be associated with that privilege of going out with microphones on long sticks during a time of COVID and making radio programs, because one of the exemptions for going out in the wider world was to do that. And another exemption puts me in mind of earworms as well, because my mum would have been 87 yesterday. She died in July last year from dementia. And this morning, I've been out to speak to a memory cafe where people who have dementia and their loved ones, could be a spouse, could be a child of my sort of age, could be a carer, they go, and music so much taps in. And I've thought a lot about earworms. So I'm not an expert. I looked up earworms because I have an idea of what an earworm is. I kept seeing the words anxiety and stress. If you just do a quick search online, that's immediately what is associated with it. But my earworms, of which there are many and have been many, are overwhelmingly friendly, not foes. So Stranger on the Shore comes up for me, which is Acabilk, beautiful but hugely popular song that got to the top of the charts in the UK. And every week when I went to my mum, who'd lost the power of speech, who I'm not even sure recognized me, until probably the last 6 months, I could put music on and music would access some part of her. She could still tap her feet. I could put a jazz band on, and she'd been to see them perhaps years and years ago, and that would tap through. And that is very powerful for me. And I'm sorry if this sounds a bit morbid, but it's what came off the top of my mind. In COVID, we lost my other half's, both her parents, to COVID. Her dad was in a care home. Her mum was infected in one of the big hospitals in Leeds, came home to our house, and she died in our front room. And we played music. Time lost any meaning. We were just with her as her life ebbed away. And on our television screen, my other half's brother put music up. And one of the pieces of music was by a British performer called Virginia Astley. I'd never heard of her. A Summer Long Since Past was the piece of music. It's church bells, it's birds, it's her quite ethereal voice. And Lizzie's final, I'm going to get emotional talking about it, Day With Us was music like that. And that actually in a very peaceful way, but a very emotional way, is in my ear. The foes, if you're a radio presenter, you have to listen to the track of the week. I'm sick to the back teeth of Freya Riding to tell me she doesn't have any friends, but that song is on repeat at our station. I'm also fairly tired of Miley Cyrus and her flowers. You sing along to the music. You also sing along to the jingles, BBC, Radio Leeds. You know, how often have I heard that? But you're on a radio station and that's part of the furniture of it. That's a sort of on the line of friend and foe. Radio presenters listen to their music too loud and get tinnitus a lot. And I think that actually is probably a bit different from an earworm. I'm not sure that's terribly friendly either. I'm going to end quickly, conscious of the time. I've always been a slightly obsessive person, and things like Shazam and Spotify have helped in that. So when I'm in the cinema, I can now just quietly Shazam, or I'm watching something on Netflix. I do watch the BBC as well, in case anybody is listening and checking. But you can find out what that Dolly Parton track is at the end of the thing you've just binge watched, actually on the BBC iPlayer, and you can follow that through. But in the past, I literally wrote to Peugeot to find out what the piece of music was in their 90s car ad. It turned out to be Smetana's Moldau, Ma Vlast, My Homeland, really patriotic music. And I got a mini CD through the post as a result of it, presented it to my other half as a present. And those sort of earworms stay with me. And now I can finally play playlists on Spotify or on iTunes or whatever, which somehow link to points, periods, and emotions in my life. And I think a lot of those are earworms. So those are overwhelmingly positive. So that's just a canter through what came into my mind with your excellent question, Fran.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. That's a perfect start to this discussion today. A bit of both and some really poignant and emotion is something I'm sure we're going to come back to across the course of our discussions. I'd now like to pass over to Ira Hyman, who is based at Western Washington University. What time is it, Ira, where you are?
It is 9:45 in the morning here.
Great, it's not too early. Thank you so much for joining us. Please, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what this means to you, this topic?
So I'm Ira Hyman. I'm a cognitive psychologist, and I study attention and memory. And every now and then I dip my toes into music cognition stuff as well. The question is actually just a wonderful question, Freya. The question of whether music stuck in your head is friend or foe. And it's always a bit of both for me as well. I have songs in my head fairly frequently, which I think is true for most of us. We've studied it in my research group, in my research team, in part, well, primarily because it was an opportunity to study involuntary thoughts and memories more generally. And so I'm interested in not just music in your head, but all of the thoughts and memories that come back into your head in a somewhat unbidden fashion. And lots of our personal memories and lots of thoughts that we're worried about come back into our head when we were not intentionally trying to recall them. And an earworm, musical imagery works the same way. The nice thing about musical imagery, about earworms, is that it's really easy to manipulate these things. As an experimental psychologist, I can play little snippets of music, or sometimes just mention an artist or a line from a piece of music. And if the person I'm talking to knows that piece of music, it might very well start playing in their head as well, which has allowed us to study these sorts of things in experimental contexts very nicely to get these things started for the participants in some of our research projects. But of course, what this has meant is that my students and I have started, we took advantage of this with each other. My students would walk past my office and start humming one of the songs that we were using in a research project, knowing that it would start playing in my head, and sometimes it was songs I was fine with, but sometimes we would use songs that people generally don't like. And they'd walk by my office and just be cruel, right? And start singing some of these things to me, which, because then it's in my head. And I'm a bicyclist. I bike to and from my office most days. And what I have found, over the years is whatever is in my head at the end of my day stays in my head as I bicycle home. And it sometimes is in my head when I'm trying to go to sleep at night. And it works that way with music as well. So that if there's a song that gets started in my head during the day, it will stick around for a while sometimes and then be on repeat in my head on the bike ride home. I discovered that when my students were being cruel to me of singing some of these songs that we all agreed we were tired of in our research, that those would be stuck in my head. And so that's the foe part, right? But the friend part was sort of realizing what this meant in terms of how you can queue up different sorts of things to play in your head, not just music, but you could take advantage of this for lots of things. So that I have found that, whatever I'm working on at the end of my day sticks in my head on my bike ride home, and it keeps churning around in there. And the music is churning around in there on my bike ride home. So I started, instead of letting my students choose my music, I would, pop on a pop song that I wanted to, have in my head playing as I was pedaling home, as I was changing out of my work clothes and into my biking clothes to bike home. And that would be in my head on the way home. And I realized that as well, I could do that with work tasks. That why would I read emails from students that made me, or administrators that made me angry at the end of my day and have that in my head? I could choose something else to have in my head, a project I was working on, or a difficult problem I was trying to solve, and let that just kind of like bounce around in there in my head on my bike ride home. And then sometimes I would get home and have nice insights or ideas that I would make notes about. So that for me, it's been kind of exploring this stuff has been interesting, not only to develop an understanding of some of the nature of having songs in your head, but also what's been a personal learning experience of doing a better job of using what I'm learning, to knowing that I'm going to have thoughts in my head anyway, to queue up the ones that I wouldn't mind having in my head. I'm going to have a song in my head. It may as well be one that I enjoy. But I'm really glad to be here with Freya, with you, to meet you, and everyone else on the panel today. So that's lovely. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ira, taking charge there, taking charge of the content of your musical memory. Thank you so much. I'd now like to pass on to Jan, and Jan is based at Kassel University, so joining us from Germany. Thanks for being here, and over to you. Music in your head, friend or foe?
Yeah, hello everyone from Germany. Well, I'm a musicologist working at the intersection of music psychology and popular music studies. And I came to earworm research by means of introspection, quite similar to what Ira just said. About 20 years ago, I was trying to find topics for seminars, for research seminars, so what we could be addressing together with students. And I pulled out a little leaflet from the mailbox of our house, and it was advertising a new restaurant called Greek restaurant Mykonos. And there's an old German Schlager, Der Stern von Mykonos, the star from Mykonos. And this music immediately popped up in my head and kept on playing. And well, I kept observing myself and I thought, well, this is interesting. I did not hear the music at all. It's just the keyword Mykonos that prompted the loop to be played. And well, retrospectively, I can't really say if this was pleasant or unpleasant, but in general, in Germany, Schlager has undergone an image change, and 20 years ago, everybody was just hating Schlager. So I would say it's probably a rather unpleasant thing to have an unwanted Schlager melody in your head. But so I started being attentive to these sorts of phenomena, and we set up a research seminar, which is basically very simple in setup. The students put together 20 tunes out of all sorts of styles, classical, rock, pop, jazz, hip hop, techno, and whatever. And we passed on the CD. At the time, we were still using CDs, so we passed on the CDs to about 60 subjects and asked them to listen to the CD as often as they liked. They could skip tunes, they could repeat tunes, whatever they like to do. And then about a week after, we started doing qualitative interviews, and then people reported what happened to them. And at the time, I didn't know that well, earworm research would become a big thing in music psychology. So the study was published in German language in the Yearbook of Music Psychology, and did not receive that much attention. But the findings are similar to those from Vicky Williamson or from Lassi Likkanen, and I don't want to spend too much time on summarizing it. But just one thing we should probably take into account is that not everybody is experiencing earworms. There's about 10% non-responders. It's people who just don't know the phenomenon, so that's something that should give us second thoughts. And the other important finding is that about two-thirds of the cases, earworm music is considered pleasant, and only 1/3 and less is considered unpleasant. So if you do have earworms, to most people, it's a pleasant experience, and so it's rather a friend than a foe. While it can last for a long time, it can last for hours, days, weeks, months, and then even the music that you prefer, if it's not a Schlager, can become a foe eventually. So this is also part of the reports we got from our subjects. Now, as we've just heard from the radio, this is a subject of great attention to the public, so it gained some media coverage. And then people started ringing me up in my office, saying, well, you're Professor Hemning. I've had this music in my head for years, and it's just the same 4 tunes taking turns, but I cannot get rid of them, and it really impairs me from sleeping. And I've sought all sorts of medical help, but I can't get any relief. And so what can I do? And over the years, I started collecting these sorts of cases with the support of Eckhard Altenmüller, who is a neurologist and one of the most prominent German neuroscientists with regard to music. So Eckhard Altenmüller, he provided some additional medical diagnosis to these subjects. And eventually we created a spectrum from the everyday earworm, or involuntary musical imagery, which I still like to call it, and two, which is really a clinical, a pathological case, which is musical hallucinations. And the particular thing about musical hallucinations is that people really believe the music is there. So they have to get up, open the door, and convince themselves that there's not a band playing next door or outside on the street. So to them, the music is really present, while all other constellations like long-term earworms or what we call hallucinosis, with suggestion from Eckhard Altmüller, people are clearly aware that it's just an imagery in their head, it's not happening outside. And this now caught the interest of the other half of me, because, as I said, I'm also into popular music studies. And you all know that also every songwriter around the globe is trying to write a catchy tune. So why is catchiness associated with popularity? You would assume that, for example, if and this is actually reported by the subject, if a tune gets stuck in your head from the very first time you're listening to it, you won't have any motivation to turn on the radio or in earlier days buy the CD or whatever, stream the music nowadays, because it's already in your head. But then with the insight from addressing hallucinations, my hypothesis is that imagined music is just a shadow, a faint memory of the real thing, and that creates the wish in us to listen to music again in reality, unless we suffer from hallucinations. And this is what possibly makes people then, well, buy the music or access it otherwise. And that's what could possibly be the link between the earworm and popularity. Yeah, when personally, I think I'm an average subject. I do have earworms like hours, weeks, months. And the strongest earworm I've probably suffered from is after I did a seminar on Pink Floyd with our students. And of course, 20-year-old students, they are not as familiar with this popular band as someone of my age. And so we started playing the old records. I've basically childhood and youth memories from myself. And this really caught me. I think this is the longest earworm I've had, like 3 months or even more, out of just playing snippets of that music in that seminar. And this, of course, last thing I'm going to say is because just as the Mykonos Schlager is a childhood memory, it's a very early thing I got to know and to store, and it's being stored very deep inside. And this is why, as we've just heard, people were suffering from dementia. They might not recognize the faces of their beloved ones anymore, but they can still access those very deep memories. And these are the strongest ones to cause earworms, and I've experienced that myself.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Rebecca, it's a great pleasure to have you with us, joining us from the Netherlands.
Yeah, hello. I'm so Rebecca Schaefer. I work at the University of Leiden, an associate professor there. So my background is actually originally in clinical neuropsychology, so working with people who've sustained some sort of brain damage, but I quickly veered off to music psychology and music cognition. And actually my first steps in doing music imagery research were because I embarked on a PhD project that aimed to let people run their wheelchair with the songs in their heads. So this is a neurotechnology development of like trying to decode brain signals into discrete communication, where if you in our Man on the Moon outcome, you could say, okay, if I want to turn right, I'll imagine song A. If I want to turn left, I'll imagine song B. So like clearly it's not that clear cut, but the assumption there was that if we have these thoughts that are so well developed over time, right? Very often we don't have a clear time structure in our thinking. And the idea behind this project was that if we imagine music, then we have a better idea of what somebody is imagining at which moment, and thus it would be easier to decode. So long story short, a little bit of a spoiler alert, that never really came to fruition, but I spent a lot of time collecting brain measurements of people imagining songs. And as such, I won't say it was always a friend, because getting people to imagine things in the lab is complicated. On a personal level, I actually hadn't really realized that I had music in my head all the time. And it was also because I was doing a lot of amateur music myself. And so whatever I had in my head was usually what I was working on at the time. And I figured it was some sort of subconscious rehearsal, which in a lot of cases it probably is. But I had never, and still don't ever experience this as a negative. Also because I tend to, if I'm done with a song in my head, I think of a new one and I continue happily. So I've sort of spontaneously found a way to deal with that for myself. In my work, it was it's been an interesting journey. I think after reading so much about different kinds of imagery and the way that people were writing about it, it also felt that we were sometimes talking about different things. So whether somebody's actively imagining something effortfully, such as they were doing in my lab experiments, or whether a song is triggered and spontaneously pops up, that to me felt like something different. And also sometimes it's really about the sound, whereas a lot of musicians also talk about visualizing the score or imagining the movements that go with playing, or having these associations that go across the different senses and different modalities, if you will. So, so I was trying to also come up with a bit of a system, or a bit of a terminology, more systematic terminology, to talk about the different ways that music imagery can manifest. In my current work, I'm still looking at music imagery, or in a way, any kind of imagery, but specifically music, on the one hand, in healthcare settings, for people to regularize their movements. So I once had an episode with a meeting, basically chance meeting, with a lady who had Parkinson's disease, who told me that if she would imagine the marching songs from her youth, this would get her all the way to the supermarket. Whereas if she didn't, then she was really having a lot of trouble walking. And so that sort of spurred a whole line of research for me, where I was looking at people moving to the songs in their heads, and what is this doing in terms of brain activation, as well as movement regularization. But of course, there's also the more emotional side of things, where if you want to regulate your mood, you can actually actively think of a different song for yourself, and make that happen. So a lot of my work has been about effortful imagery, so not so much the spontaneous. I would probably have had a much rougher time even in the lab if it was only about spontaneous imagery. But something that more recently we've been diving into is also, how do people differ in terms of their ability to do these things, in terms of their ability to focus, in terms of their ability to simulate. How much detail does this can they give themselves? And currently, some of our efforts are focused on pedagogy. So if music students need to practice, so how can they also sort of lift the stresses on their bodies by imagining their musical material, and also adding more context in their imagery to the musical message that they're producing. So so while it started in this really applied setting, I've had a long journey with this phenomenon as well, to sort of suss out all the details in terms of how can we harness this in well-being settings. Which is also nice that this pulls together the theme of your story, Freya.
Beautifully, it does. Thank you so much. Absolutely perfect. Thank you to all of our panelists, and I look forward to us exploring some of these topics as we go along today. This will be your last opportunity to scan this QR code if you haven't yet jotted down anonymously some examples for yourselves of when you've imagined music and you felt it to be more of a friend or more of a foe. By all means, add some more, because we're about to move on to another slide now. I have as well. Yay. Thank you. Perfect. Right. So I now wanted to just step back a little bit and stay with what we've mostly been speaking about so far, but not exclusively. Particularly Rebecca was talking there quite a bit about some of the times that we voluntarily imagine music, but just for the moment, staying with some research that was done and a scale that's been devised by Georgina Floridou and colleagues, which is called the Involuntary Musical Imagery Scale. Because as I was thinking about today's event, I was reminded of the 4 different factors that there are within their scale. So this was a scale that they devised and was published in a special issue on musical imagery that I was the editor of back in 2015. And this scale's gone on to be used in quite a few studies since then. The idea is it's like a questionnaire you fill out, and it allows researchers to see what different aspects of involuntary musical imagery stand out for individuals, but much more in research is about looking at groups of people. And the 4 factors are as follows. You've got negative valence. So an example of an item of that scale is I try hard to get rid of my earworms. So that would be one of the negative valence items on the scale. And then a second factor is movement. So this has come up already. I'm thinking about Ira cycling home from work. Movement, an example here is the way I move is in sync with my earworms. The third factor is personal reflections. And I think this is a really interesting one for us to, again, think a little bit more in a slightly more nuanced way, perhaps. An example here is the content of my earworms mirrors my state of worry or concern. And then the fourth of the factors is help. It's called how do earworms essentially, how does involuntary musical imagery, you should use the academic term, how does involuntary musical imagery help? And an example of one of those items is I find my earworms help me focus on the task that I'm doing. So already with the scale that's been devised, we're already getting a sense of maybe some of the spectrum of experience that might range from more positive to more negative. And I wanted to start by that and move on to talk about some of, I'm going to need to pull up my slides here because I got a slightly awkward angle. I could do, yeah, let me do that. There we go. That's more natural for me anyway. I'm used to pacing around when I'm lecturing. Much better. Yes, I wanted to just jot down on a slide the things I could think of, the different aspects of experience that for me seem to sort of range from instances when imagining music, the music in our head, musical imagery is the term that we use, seems to be more of a foe right the way through to more of a friend. But a huge caveat right from the start is that so much of it depends on who you are, what you're experiencing, and how you relate to these different experiences. And that's certainly a lot of the work that Ira does as well, thinking about when does this become intrusive versus not. So we have intrusive thought right up there in the left-hand corner. That's clearly an instance of when the music in our head is really not serving us well. We're experiencing it as intrusive. We don't want it. We probably want to get rid of it. Imagining music also can be related to have negative associations, as in we might be imagining music that has a negative association, or the fact of listening to imagining this music in turn creates its own new negative associations. We can have musical imagery which is associated quite closely with different people, and that's in the middle. to suggest that that can be positive or negative. Really, that's just in itself a fairly neutral thing. It all depends on how we feel about that person or those people when it comes to that music in our head. But of course, we can also have those positive associations with the music that we're imagining, or with the context in which we initially heard it, or a positive relationship with that imagined music, even by virtue of imagining it. You can do that. Back over to the left-hand side, we have mental obsession. There has been some research demonstrating, other research not demonstrating quite so strongly, but there's some research showing links between imagining music and sometimes some traits associated with obsessive compulsive disorder. Again, back through to the middle, we've got memories. That could obviously, when we're talking about involuntary musical imagery, we tend to be mostly talking about a form of memory for music that we already know. It's much less common in the research literature for people to be reporting imagining novel music, although it does happen. Musical hallucinations we've spoken about already. Linked to that, we have this idea of musical hallucinosis as well, which has been looked at by Jan and a few others as well. And this group in the middle here, I noticed something pop up in the chat earlier. I'm not sure what it is because I can't read it from here, but I think somebody put something about sleep. Now, revealing too much about myself, I really struggle to sleep sometimes because of the music in my head. Or is the music in my head the problem? And I have some other problem which is leading to me imagining the music. So I can spend a long time wondering that as well, which doesn't help when you're trying to get to sleep. So at bedtime, experiencing imagining music is something which can be experienced in a negative way or in a positive way. Work by Dr. Michelle Hulot has looked at, we've published a paper on this, looking at a survey that was looking at experiences of anxiety and the relationship between anxiety and imagining music and sleep in a kind of three-way relationship there. It's very difficult to unpack. It was just a correlational survey, but I think that there's some important work to be done there. Musical dreams. There's some research on musical dreams. Again, that's another form of imagining music. But then we can also think about music, the music in our heads as being a form of mental company. And I think that's been alluded to by some of our discussions so far already from the panel. Sometimes it can be quite comforting. Sometimes it can serve almost like a social purpose. We might not actually be in the room with anybody else, but maybe there's a sense that the music that we're imagining is like a form of company. And there's an increasing research interest and focus on how we might relate to music as a kind of social other anyway. And I think that that's an interesting question too, to me at least, which is all those questions we have as music psychologists about the role and functions of music, actually presented and played music in the external environment. How many of those same questions actually relate to what it is that we're imagining and the content of our thoughts, our musical thoughts? To fill the silence, maybe that's another thing that we're doing. And I don't know how much we think about what's going on. And these are all questions that I would love to see more exploration of. I'm going to come to the bottom left-hand side in a moment. We have this sense of music sometimes providing momentum for us. Maybe it keeps us going and it propels us forward. Maybe it's also a way of marking time in a sense as well. Sometimes quite literally to support movement and gait as well, which is something. Entertainment. Yeah, why not? Maybe we're actually imagining music. It's kind of entertaining to do that sometimes. And I'm really glad that some really positive examples of imagining music have come up from the panel as well. There's a sense that imagining music can be a cherished experience, which is the term that's been used by in a lovely paper actually, which was looking at imagining music as pleasurable. And when people can think of a piece of music they really love and they intentionally sort of use their imaginations to prolong that experience and relive that experience of really enjoying that music. I'm going to come to resilience in a bit. We've touched on perhaps some of the ways in which we might be able to use imagining music to support recovery and rehabilitation for therapeutic goals, the way that we can actually use our minds to lead to physical movement and physical change that might not otherwise be possible. I wonder how much imagining music might have a spiritual link as well. And I'm just not aware of research in that area, but I'd be fascinated to learn more about it. I'd also really be interested to look at cross-cultural differences. Imagining music, thinking of it more rather than as it's an earworm, but thinking of it more as it's actually a form of thought. And this really intrigues me, how it is that I was talking to my mum about this. I was talking to her about this event, and she sort of said, well, it's like we don't think about it. It's just the way we are. We just have these thoughts because that's what they are ultimately. It's just who we are. But if you think about it, imagining music is so much a part of our thoughts, our thinking. We just don't necessarily pay attention to it or think about it in that way. We can use our imaginations to be creative as well. We can deliberately compose music. And maybe actually this music in our heads is part of our identity, it's part of who we are, and that's something that I think deserves more attention. Before I move on, because I don't want to hog the whole session, that's not why you're here, is to hear me talking. I just wanted to come back to musicians, and that's absolutely true. Those of us who play music, after rehearsing and performing, I know that I really struggle to get that music out of my head. After a rehearsal, it's going to really be playing on my mind and again, keeping me awake. But that's the foe. What about the friend? Mental rehearsal. Absolutely. It's really great that as musicians, we have that ability. We have that ability to use our capacities and our training as musicians to be able to voluntarily imagine music and use that to our advantage. We can indeed avoid injury perhaps by using our imaginations to rehearse and to perform that way. Okay. I'd like to just press next because there are gaps, and I think that I'd like us as a kind of community to maybe collaborate a little bit more to fill some of these gaps. What are the other ways in which the music in our heads is meaningful for us in our lives, and how do they differ, and what's that like, and what's the phenomenology of it? And I think, although I'm delighted to see musical imagery research has really expanded in recent years, I think there's a lot more that we could do, maybe that we could do collectively as well. Okay. Oop. Thank you. Right. As I say, I don't want to hog the entire session, so I'd like to move on and ask for the audio to be played, please. I'd like to you just to listen to this before you click on go. What I'm going to play now is a really interesting audio example that doesn't need any introduction in the sense of what it's going to say. You'll hear that for yourself, but does need some introduction as to why I'm playing it. So Victoria Hume is a songwriter, an artist, and she had been doing some work in intensive care units, interviewing people who'd been in intensive care about their experiences and incorporating some of their experiences as an inspiration to her songwriting. But also she's produced an album called Delirium, where she intersperses her songs with extracts from interviews that these people who've been interviewed have kindly agreed could be made available for others to listen to. And I just really like you to take a listen to this particular example.
When I was in intensive care, what I do remember is that there was always music playing, always. And I never thought anything of it, but literally everything would be accompanied by music, like long symphonies. And I said to my mum, like, yeah, it was classical music. I said to my mum, like, quite a long time afterwards, God, that's so weird. We went to visit someone else in intensive care, and I was like, can I get a pin drop in it? She was like, yeah, and I was like, I remember the radio was always on, and I could picture the radio beside me. She was like, never a radio on, it's always dead quiet. So I think that basically my brain must be keeping me company. and creating, well, you know, sort of structure and form. You know, you have like a section, an A section or whatever, and you kind of it gives you something predictable to hang on to in a way, and you know it's going to come to an end, and then something else is going to take. And I remember also that all the doctors were just like, you know, why is my daughter like so kind of stoic? Because I mean, it was awful. It was you know, traumatic and incredibly painful and worrying, what have you. But I don't know. I think because it sounds really cheesy, but I think because I had this kind of musical, I don't know what you call it, kind of like a backdrop, I suppose, that it meant it was survivable. It really kind of kept me plugged into like life, or you know what I'd done before. I can't remember specifically what it was. It wasn't like there was a piece. It was kind of life. It was a distraction. It was hope. It was structure. It was form. It was company. You know, it's the one thing about being in hospital, especially in intensive care, when the night called off work, it's so lonely, so boring, and it's sort of horribly confusing, and also and frightening as well. You know, lots of funny noises. I think in a way, I don't know. It sort of blocks a lot of things out as well. It's kind of like a filter, and I've often thought, God, what if you don't have that experience, or you don't have that in your sort of bones or in your chemistry, or you know, you don't clench or whatever, you go to intensive care. What happens? What does your brain do? And then Epic, I mean, it wasn't just like a quartet, it was like a proper full-on, you know, big old 19th century orchestra with, you know, brass and horns and everything. I remember the first time I went to the proms and I had like a Brook and a symphony, and I had this real kind of like, I've heard this before. It was weird.
I think that's the end. So I hope you could hear enough. I think that's really poignant, again, the word comes to me, example of somebody who's had such a profound experience of what they were doing was they were imagining music at a time when there was a real need for that person to be resilient, to feel like they had some company, something that was with them in various ways. So a really striking example, I think, of many of the things that are on here. Resilience is one of them. And another example that somebody reminded me of resilience and imagining music was, I don't know if anybody's seen the film, I haven't read the book, but Touching the Void. It's about a climbing accident in a mountaineer, and Joe Simpson. He thought he was going to die in this mountaineering accident, but he talks about how he had Boney M, Brown Girl in the Rain, stuck in his head, and he hates this music, but in a sense it almost kept him going. It was just going round and around and around and around, and it really stands out for him when he thinks back on that time, how this music just was in his head going around and around and around. And maybe there's a link there to resilience. Thank you for all of your contributions on the Padlet of things that you've been finding to be more of a friend and maybe more of a foe. Some of these things have already come up in our discussion so far. So we've had In Dreams came up, Like a Friend. A couple of people have said that. Imagining music when I can't sleep really helps. I'm glad that some people find that a helpful thing to calm down. And then, yeah, when recalling a scene from a movie or musical, the music comes into your head. When it's functional to be able to imagine music. If you're a DJ, this can be a useful skill. And then, yes, doing housework. I'm the same, unless I just put on actual music, which I do increasingly now. And then, yeah, I love this. I also love to hear whatever my head brings out to me. So your head is serving as a jukebox for you. That's great. Really good. And then that relationship between music and mood is coming out, as well as a friend. Gets me flowing when improvising. That's really interesting. There was a fascinating PhD by somebody based at the Royal Northern College of Music, Keith Phillips, who was interested in the role of imagining music during improvisation and the extent to which we do that or not, actually. Reducing anxiety, yeah, absolutely. And there's some research that we're writing up at the moment, which again comes from Michelle's PhD, where we were using imagining music as a deliberate intervention to try and reduce anxiety. So I think that there are some good applications for this too. Pleasure from reimagining, favorite parts of tunes, constant companion. Yeah, anxiety is coming through again, occupying my mind when I'm anxious. And then somebody here talking about when the music's really vivid in their head, how it's a delight to do that. Sometimes the music in my head makes me realize something I hadn't acknowledged or suppressed, perhaps. So that's, again, kind of self-knowledge, self-awareness. And then, yes, company. A few examples of it's a foe trying to sleep after orchestra rehearsals. Yes, they end at 10 p.m. Yeah, I'm with you on that. Definitely. When you can only remember bits and pieces and it drives you crazy. Yes, can't sleep with repetitive bursts of music in my head. Sorry to hear about that. Yeah, sometimes getting the sped up songs on things like TikTok stuck in your head. Yeah, that must be annoying. Oh yes, John Rutter, Christmas music. Getting stuck in your head as well. Music associated with bad memories, music I did not choose. There's a sense in which you don't always have control, and that's a big part of this phenomenon very often. Annoying, irritating. Sometimes it's too repetitive and will not stop. Yeah. Sometimes I cannot focus on what I'm doing because of music in my head. Thank you so much for that. We're going to move on now. And I'm going to ask if we have any questions from the audience for our panelists, or Alinka, if there are any questions online. Otherwise, we do have a question in the physical room. Should we start with that?
Yes, okay.
Joanna.
Please go ahead. There's a microphone coming.
Hi, my name is Johanna, and as Freya knows, and yeah, Alinka, I've done research on earworms and my PhD was on it. And my theory was that you can, it's a manifestation of a conditioning process between everyday life and the music that we listen to in our everyday life. So yeah, I was trying to see if I can see that connection in my experiments. But regarding to what you were saying, Ara, about the thoughts after your whole day going to bed and music popping up, I was actually thinking when I was trying to see if my model works and how it works and where everything fits, whether there are different types of earworms and different types of music in our head. And yes, we associate music with our everyday activities, like Freya was saying, with chores and housework, because that's how we listen to music in our everyday lives. But also, can it be that we associate our thoughts? So it goes to the next level. So we associate the music with the activity that we're doing. And then is it possible that we associate the earworms with the activity that we're doing? And then is it possible that we have different types of earworms? So the before going to bed types, can it be that it's just a sorting of memory? Like we're passing everything that happened through the day in a process of going to the short term from short-term memory to the long-term memory. And yeah, it's such a difficult thing because it's thoughts, so we can associate them with everything. And yeah, what are your thoughts about that?
I think if I may, what I'm hoping to do a little bit later is kind of come to methods, because I think there's a really great question that's going to relate to that. So if I may, I might kind of hold on to that one and come back to it in a bit.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe we've got time for 2 questions most.
I think you were asking a number of different things there, but actually one of the questions I had was about methods. You know, what are the strengths and and limitations of different methods that can be used to study earworms. And another question that I had was about the ethics of it, given that earworms can be problematic. And I don't know whether radio stations think about this as well, but given that they can be problematic, is it, is it ethical to be playing different, these different songs within your experiments? So we had two questions. Well, we had a question online. My question is, if I need to get to sleep, how can I get John Cage's 4:33 to be in my head?
Oh, fantastic.
And then we had another comment after that, say, try getting Eric Whittaker's Sleep in your head as well. But we haven't got anything specific. We have got another question here, particularly, or a comment and question saying, I'm particularly interested in further research or comments from the panelists on how musical imagery can be utilized for stress reduction or relaxation. So perhaps that's something to go around the panel with.
Yeah, great question. So yeah, I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about that from, yes, Ira?
I think Rebecca has something too. Rebecca,
Okay.
go. Okay. I mean, for me, I have sort of a set of music in my back pocket that I always kind of imagine if I'm trying to calm down. So I enjoy jazz, and so I'll just cue up in my head from Miles Davis the album Kind of Blue, and let parts of that run through my head, which is very calming for me. And I find that can be, having a piece of music that's in your head that you can use for different purposes, right? If I'm trying to crank up while I'm working out, and there's not music around me, I might run something else through my head, obviously, but for calming down or sometimes trying to get something else out of my head, it's nice to have, what would be for you one that really well and you can get started, and that won't become annoying if it sticks around for a while. And so that one's mine. I don't know, Rebecca, what's your strategy?
Yeah, no, it's actually very, very, very similar. And I mean, on a personal level, I'm more a silent way than Kind of Blue, but potato, potato. But I do think that there are personal pieces of music that you can, if you can remember them well enough, right? Because again, this is also based on memory, that you kind of can keep for that moment. And honestly, I do exactly the same if I'm stressed and I can't sleep. So this is indeed, I have the same strategy as you, Ira. But I think if we're looking at clinical applications and in terms of music being used in stress reduction, I think we're seeing some interesting developments in the sense that there are certain aspects of the music that seem to be effective for everyone, namely like not a lot of dynamical changes, relatively slow tempi, like not too much happening that's distracting or that's exciting, and that those principles are even more powerful than the music, than whether the a clinician or the patient is selecting the music, right? So there we're going to sort of touch on like what are more general musical qualities that lower arousal, right? That lower activation levels, and I think maybe the real clue to making it personal is that it's not just about lowering arousal, that it's also about like calming yourself in your own particular situation that would still make self-selected music relevant here. And also I have a bit of resistance to the idea that it really doesn't matter who selects the music. So I think maybe the last word is said on those findings, but it does speak to this sort of interesting interaction between the more general, maybe perhaps universal qualities between people or within particular cultures, and the more individualistic things that are that trigger people personally to feel better.
Thanks, Andrew. Did you?
I think the question of ethics and radio stations and the music industry is interesting, given that there are people who've made a career out of trying to get those tunes wedged in our minds. And radio presenters, certainly at my level, I'm a speech journalist, we don't get to choose the music. So we play what we're given. unless I'm making a specific program. I'm making one about my mum to coincide with the first anniversary of her death and dementia, in which some of the tunes that were her and my earworms will feature, which is quite interesting. I made a program with the former Prime Minister, John Major, whose father was a music hall performer. And John Major went and stood on the stage at the Leeds City Varieties. I was chairing the session. I made a program out of it. And I still have in my mind some of the music hall tunes, which have then gone on to become hits in the 50s and the rest of it that play through. But I just wrote down one thing here when you were talking about rehearsal. I'm no musician, but at university, I sang in the university chorus, very similar auditorium to this, and I can still belt out Carl Orff's O Fortuna, because it just for some reason was part of something very powerful and emotional. And I also think of the rehearsal and the fact that I couldn't quite reach some of the notes, and that was interesting. Final thought is about the music that plays in your ears. So London Marathon yesterday, people now run habitually with music in their ears, literally. I used to do a lot of running, never ran with music in my ears. But if you do something like the Great North Run, you have music under every flyover on the motorways. There would be a mock Lindisfarne band doing Fog on the Tyne. Or the tune that's in my mind is the Spencer Davis Group, Keep On Running. And all the time you've been talking, I somehow got London Marathon and I got blooming Spencer Davis Group. But what did I do? I've got a colleague who's autistic who I work with, and he wanted very specific suggestions of music he could run the Rob Borough Marathon. This is a big marathon in Leeds that's coming up, and he wanted his soundtrack to be spelled out for him. And what did I say? Spencer Davis Group, Keep On Running. And I wonder whether that will now become his earworm, which is my imaginary earworm when I used to do all that running, but never with him actually playing.
Great. Thank you. I think let's move on, because I really want to get to this question of ethics again in even more depth, and think about research methods. I'm going to move on, hopefully move my slides on to a second Padlet. I promise this is the last time I'm going to be asking you for this sort of input. I will have one more QR code at the end. But I would be grateful if everybody could, if you get your phones out. And I'm really curious to know, what do you think is interesting and significant and meaningful that deserves research attention on this topic, thinking about the way that imagining music, the music in our head, relates to well-being, our health. What's its significance for us? How does it relate to our identity? Really interested to know what you think. With this one, I believe there's also, if I set it up correctly, the option to upvote as well. So if you like what somebody else has put, I'd really appreciate it if you could do that as well. And let's see what seems to be coming through for people as what are the priorities? What should we be researching here? What matters on this topic? And I'm going to try and pull it up so that we can discuss the answers as they come through live. What could possibly go wrong? Apart from my throwing my papers on the floor again, I think it's going to be all right. Okay. So I'm braced. I'm ready for all your answers to come through here. And I'm hoping that this will lead quite nicely onto a discussion about methods, appropriate methods, ethics, all of that, because it isn't easy.
Freya, can I say something about ethics and research methods?
Oh, yes, please do. Yeah.
Because I mean, for us in my research lab, getting songs stuck in people's heads felt less aversive than asking people to get particularly awful autobiographical experiences stuck in their head. And so for me, it was a lesser of evils in terms of research methodology. If we can explore the factors that make a song start to feel aversive, the repetition contributes to that, and the distraction from your ongoing activity contributes to that. So that even something positive can start to feel aversive if it's been in your head for a week and keeping you from getting on to other things. And so for us in my lab, it was more ethical to get songs stuck in people's heads than necessarily to remind them of painful personal experiences. And so it's always a set of trade-offs, right? When it's the ethics of doing these things, of what can I, what sort of nasty things can I get, or positive things can I get stuck in people's heads, and how do they reflect on it?
Thank you. Rebecca, you were nodding. Did you want to say something about ethics as well, or no, not?
No, I think it's always. Unless we understand to what extent for everyone we're giving them the same kind of experience, right? We also don't really know what it is that we're inflicting, and I think so. Where some people report having continuous earworms and other people report having it every now and again, and a proportion of people never having any, right? So albeit a much smaller proportion, I think it's also really complicated to think about ethics when we don't know more about just the basic distributions in terms of how these thoughts work for people.
Right, so thank you for the responses that are coming in here. And do like those comments that you particularly appreciate. One that's got 3 thumbs up is, can earworms help repair damaged pathways in our brains? So this is a question about music and neural pathways. So that's a very interesting one. I don't know if anyone's got any comment on that. We also have conditions in earworms. You touched on anxiety. I was just wondering how much it plays into and differs with other conditions. I have ADHD and constantly have earworms. I can't deal, oh, it's gone, moved. I can't deal with silence, so they're necessary for me, but also they become more intense and intrusive the more stressed I get. It would be interesting to see how neurodivergence affects earworms and how to turn a bad one into something good. That's an excellent entry there. So thank you for that. I agree. Neurodivergence, and I'd like to see more diversity as well in terms of who's conducting the research and where we're conducting the research. And this isn't just an issue for research on musical imagery. As we know, it's a much wider issue than that. But there was an interesting article by Lassie Likanen and I believe Kelly Jakubowski, and I'm sorry if I've forgotten a third author, possibly in the virtual room, I apologize. It's a very good paper, but it was a study of tweets on earworms, but of course they had to restrict that to English language, and so it gave us an interesting sort of snapshot of who was talking about earworms and what was being said about earworms. But I think that there are possibly sorts of assumptions that we make about what it is to imagine music that are based on who we are, where we come from, and where we're living, and the sorts of experiences that are typically shared. And I think that it'll be really interesting to expand our horizons a little bit. Other comments on here we have, yes, support people in how to deal with intrusive and unwelcome earworms, brackets, please. I would love to be involved in that. I think it's really worthwhile. I do think about the question of ethics for this. I think about those people who've got in touch with me, as they have done with you, Jan, over the years, who've said, yes, I'd be willing to be involved in future research. And I sort of hesitate because I know I need to take them at their word because they volunteered to do this, but I also, you are wary, I'm wary of, sort of, I don't want to make anything worse through, I don't think any of us wants to make anything worse through the research that we do. Anything else that's particularly popular here? Yes, in that case, I'll just open up the last couple of minutes to the panel on anything to do with maybe what you think we should be working on in this area, or any comments about the challenges of researching what somebody else is imagining, how we do that, and research ethics. I think I'm sure everybody would love to hear your thoughts. So over to any of you. And if you'd like more to say about BBC radio presenting, and yes, the ethics of playing Miley Cyrus again, you have no choice. Anybody on the panel have anything to say, or anybody in the audience?
Well, I
Have
could
any
say
opinion?
something regarding to stress and well-being, just very general points. But one thing has become clear from the many earworm studies over the years, that it's a very natural phenomenon. Everybody, except for the non-responders, is experiencing the phenomenon. And as I said, it can be minutes, but it can be months. And that is completely normal. There's nothing wrong with you if you experience that. Next thing is, and that's also a question to Ira, because that's where I drew on your work, the situations where earworms arise. It's usually either in stress situations. You mentioned that Mountaineer episode, where his life was threatened. He had Bonnie M all the time in his head. And the other situation is when you're underloaded mentally, so you're waiting for the bus, you're washing dishes and these sorts of things, and that's when music pops to your head, because I believe that your mental system at this moment, underload or overload, starts a mind-wandering process to find an alternative strategy. So and then what comes to your thoughts, what comes to your awareness, is very nearly stored memories, and these can be episodes from the day, but these can be musical traces from the tunes you've just heard on the radio. So to relieve stress and to learn to live with it, and also probably to go to sleep easier, is to just accept what's happening, and just to know a little bit more about why and how earworms arise. So if you can't go to sleep because music keeps popping to your head, it might be that there is still a stress situation pertaining, and your mind wandering is going on because it's trying to find a relief for that stress. And the music popping up is just a symptom for the stress, but not the stress cause itself. That's sort of a very general remark I could make at this point.
Thank you. And I'd like to relate that to somebody's put here and pointed out, you know, it's thinking about individual differences, and everyone has to find their own way. And of course, we've already talked about this, the just how subjective this is as an experience. But the question, you know, the comment here is, can we apply the same interventions to everyone equally? How should they be personalized? So yeah, some shaking of the head. No, we can't do the same thing for everybody. Absolutely not. But yes, sort of thinking of it as being a little bit like a toolkit if you are experiencing imagining music when you don't want to, but also finding ways to harness those positive, beneficial ways of imagining music too. An inspiration for me thinking about today's event has been to there's a really fascinating project that was run in Durham called Hearing the Voice, which was about, well, as it sounds, hearing voices, and they took a really interdisciplinary approach to trying to understand this, and I do think that we can probably learn quite a lot. I've been trying to delve into historic accounts of people imagining music. It's really hard to find. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. Joanna wanted to say something to that.
Sorry, to what was Jan saying before, actually, about the circumstances. So I was looking at parallels between everyday music literature and ENMI literature, and I was thinking about that paper from Krause and North about dominance and control over the music that you listen to. And if you have dominance and control over when and what you listen to, then you have more chances of it being pleasurable. And I was thinking that actually might apply to music in our head. So if it would be something that we would be listening to at that time, then the experience would be pleasurable. Whereas if it's something that it's not coherent to what is going through in our life, then the experience might be unpleasant. And yeah.
I think that ties really nicely to a recent paper of Ira's, who sent me that to look at, and the sort of, I mean, do you want to say something briefly? We'll have to finish soon, Ira, but if you'd like to sort of comment on this sort of, yes, congruency and that kind of thing.
So just real quick, I think, Jan, I agree completely with you. And that's what some of our data show is that I'm of the view that your mind is constantly suggesting things to us that might be useful in the moment. And so it's taking all of these cues out there in the world and popping up all sorts of things that might be potentially useful. Some of those are memories, some of those are other thoughts, some of them are images, and a lot of it for some of us is music. And a lot of the time it's actually not particularly relevant. And you're like, well, thanks a lot, but I'm not really worried about that right now. But every now and then it's a good hit, right? And so it's useful. But for some of these sorts of things with music, right? When things get quiet, then the mind fills back in. When it's quiet around you, or when it's too overwhelming, the mind might fill back in to do something else for you. And sometimes these things can start to feel intrusive when it's repeated, when it's already something you don't really like, and when it's kind of getting in your way. But oftentimes, and Jan, I think you said this earlier as well, and Rebecca, I think you've said something about this. A lot of these, musical imagery things are things we enjoy. I generally like most of the songs that get stuck in my head, and as the question noted, it's because of what I've been listening to recently. And so for the most part, when I'll go right back around to where you asked me to start, Freya, friend or foe, it's mostly friend. I like the stuff that's playing in my head because I tend to like the music that I'm listening to, unlike Andrew, who has to listen to whatever they're playing on the BBC for him today. I get to pick and choose, and it's wonderful.
Andrew?
Just an observation, it may be useful or not, but I've taught radio journalism and production for a long time, and one of the things you come to realize quite quickly is people will put up, frankly, with any old nonsense if somebody's talking, but if they hate the music, particularly now they've got a radio where they can instantly change, they'll flip away. So if somebody has got a predisposition to listen to my program, has heard me chuntering on for a few years, but the subject is tedious as hell, they'll bear with it. If they don't like the music, they'll hit that button and they're gone. And I'm just thinking about whether that has any relevance to the tunes in our head, I don't know. But that's why music is targeted on radio stations at what you believe is your right audience. And that a lot of research goes into making those tunes the right ones. So in other words, if you've got your target audience listening and they go, there's that Freya Riding song again, boof, I'll go on to something else. Sorry, Freya, it's a great song. But if that hasn't worked for the audience, that means that they're not here to hear the next boring conversation that they'll put up with for 10 minutes, because that's all right. They'll literally have a minute and a half of the song, boof, they found another radio station. And it just made me think about the tunes in our own heads when I was talking about the tunes we inflict on other people through the radio.
Yeah, thank you. And I do think that overall, as a way to think about this, what you said, Joanna, is absolutely right. I think it probably is useful for us to begin to ask the same questions of the music in our head as we have asked already of the music that we listen to. And so much comes down to control and how you're feeling and where you are and what you're doing. And Linka.
There are sort of two more questions left, so I don't know whether maybe have we got time
let's take those and then
for two more.
Yeah.
Okay. Scott has posed a question. Scott Bannister. He says, I found the mental company idea of musical imagery interesting. I saw company mentioned a few times on the Padlet too. It made me think of sort of social concepts, as if the musical imagery gives a sense of presence when alone, similar to turning the television on for some background when at home alone. Wondering if this perspective has been explored in the research at all.
Yes, Scott, great question. And it's research I want to do. And maybe we should talk about that, Scott, because I think that will be some really interesting research. I do think part of the answer, I do think that there possibly is an important social component to bizarrely, in a way, to what we're doing in our heads. I think we can think of our minds in a way as being sort of company for ourselves. But it does bring me back to the comment that was made before about what we do know about sort of the level of stimulation in our environment too. So very often if we're alone, perhaps that level of stimulation is quite low. And so maybe that's another reason why in those times, if we're not in the company of others, that might also be another reason that we're imagining music at that time and relate to it in that way. Just like not having the radio on, you haven't got that level of stimulation, and maybe you're providing your own. I don't know if anybody else has anything to say about that on the panel. If not, let's go for, oh, Rebecca, yeah.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think in a lot of these discussions, it's just really helpful to keep on distinguishing between the spontaneous activity and the things that we deliberately do, right? So I think a strategy in a particular moment, such if you're if you're trapped in a mine, I think there was a famous story about people trying to mark the time that they were trapped somewhere, like and very deliberately giving yourself something to do or something to relate to, I think is still a different situation from the kind of thing that Jan also mentioned, like whether the mind is filling stuff in or overriding something that it doesn't want. But overall, I think it can have that interactive type of quality depending on the level of control.
Let's have that last question.
Yeah, just as a last question, it's really to Andrew about we've sort of asked the audience here, the 20 or so here and the 40 or so online, kind of what's important to them or what matters to them. And I'm just wondering, you know, we've got quite an academic audience. I'm wondering, do you feel that this would be of interest to your radio listeners? How many radio listeners are? How might we reach them to understand more about this phenomenon and what matters to them, so that the research could have real impact?
I think if you use the phrase earworm, people have an idea what that is. They say it normally positively. That tune is a real earworm, they will say. And I think if it's the usual thing, if we can talk about it in language that people understand and relate it to their lives, I think it's a really good subject. Because if I've right from the start, when we were first able to get people to interact with our program, initially on text and then through all the different social media, email followed the text and all the rest of it. So having a conversation with our audience is something I've always wanted to do. And if I said, what's your earworm, or is an earworm a good or a bad thing, people could answer that question. And I think it's like any topic, it's a great subject. And if I could get, well, everybody here could talk about it, you know, I think relating it, you know, the way that hearing about Parkinson's and getting to the shops, this wonderful, my other half's mum, when I was talking about that piece of music that was so evocative, she had Parkinson's, and it just really made me think this is so interesting about the soundtrack of our lives and how we act. And music to me is a great comfort, a massive comfort. And I, like so many people, if I'm feeling low, I've been driving back, watching my mum decline on the motorway, endlessly listening to music. I turn to classical music for comfort, to let my own mind wander. And I think that whole idea that music is a nourishment for me, and my mind somehow, in the same way as I can go to my playlists and find the music that's right for my moment. I'm so interested in this comment of taking your moment when you leave work. I often walk to and from work, and when I leave work on Thursday evening, and I might stick my buds in again, I'll think, right, I'm going to have some music that's just the music that I want to be that soundtrack for my evening. And I do that. I de-stress doing it. But if I start on a different piece of music, not something somber, if I went for Keep On Running, perhaps I'll get home 10 minutes quicker. I don't know. But, you know, you've just really made me think. I'd love to talk about it on the radio. It's like anything.
Well, on this very general level, this has been done.
Yes, indeed. So we should mention the earwormery. So this was a project that I think Lauren Stewart from Goldsmiths and colleagues at Goldsmiths conducted a few years ago, where they teamed up with Radio 6 and had people sending in what music are you imagining, and a bit of information about it. But I would absolutely love to come. I have been, you know, since organising this event, I have been lucky enough to be invited twice. I've done a couple of interviews talking on local radio about this event, and I do think it's something that we can all relate to. And I also think that a sort of citizen science approach to understanding what I think as researchers, with the best one in the world, we can get a little bit siloed into what interests us. I think sometimes it's really refreshing to hear what you know, normal people, not that we're not normal, but what normal people are thinking, because, you know, it's just incredibly rich, and it's important that we make sure that we're researching questions that really matter to people.
Let's do it.
Perfect. On that note, I'd like to thank everybody. I'd love to thank the panelists. Thank you, Ira. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you to all the audience. Thanks for being here today. Thanks for all of your input. And I'm going to move on to possibly, in my mind, the most important slide of all. I am in the process of starting to pull together a network of people who are interested in the topic of links between imagining music and health. And I'm really trying to reach out to as many people as possible from diverse disciplines, from researchers, people who just might like to be involved in the network as participants, just because you're interested. Please get in touch with me if you'd like to be involved in this. I'd really love to extend my collaborations and really start to address some of those questions that you've come up with today and the things that matter to you. So I'd love it if you could do that one last QR code. There's a couple of questions about your thoughts on today, but there's also a place for you to leave your name and email address if you're interested in getting involved in this. Thank you once again. And thank you to Colin and Jack and Dan as well, and the technical team, and Alinka for moderating. Thanks, everyone.